We are at our second to last sphere in our 6-line series. Today we'll talk about the sphere of the core, and then we'll finish up with the sphere of purpose as it relates to the Venus sequence. And the sphere of the core is a deep, deep wound. It's something that we're born into this world with. So give yourself time as you think about this, as you contemplate the key, as you contemplate your lines. We're born into separateness, right? In our mother's womb, we're still connected to the one. And then we come out and immediately we have this feeling that something isn't quite right. So these aren't things that happen to you in your life. This is a part of humanity. And because of that, these lines are a little bit more collective in nature, and the healing that you're doing is a healing for the collective. This is where we get the archetype of the wounded healer. And if you want to make impact in the world, you have got to own your vulnerability. It isn't comfortable for any of us, for me, to admit that we have these wounds, that we have this healing to do. But you've got to look this in the eye and deal with it. And that is how we can make an impact. That's how we get our power. Otherwise, you just stay the wounded victim because you're ignoring what's happening. And our core becomes our vocation, right? This is the same gene key, core and vocation. And that's because outer success requires inner transmutation. So it's you transmuting this wound that you then share what you learn with the world. And that's what starts your path along the pearl sequence. And when I say that this is a collective wound, what I mean by that is it's still yours, but you're just a much wider being than you realize you are. And it takes some time to sit with that. So what we have here in each line is the wound itself, and then underneath is what we need in order to heal that wound. So line number 1 is repression and honesty. And this is my line here. So I've thought a lot about it. And essentially repression is hidden, unexpressed fear. Interestingly, I have the 32nd gene key in my life's work, and it's all about failure. And essentially failure is a panic that something's going to go wrong. It's this repressed fear that we felt on the savannah, that we felt in the jungle. And what you have to do is look inward to the source of that fear, to the source of that suffering, because it is not from anything that's happening in the environment around you. Can you be afraid of something? Of course. But even if you're in the most peaceful place and you're having a beautiful experience, if you stop for a moment and stop all the distractions and turn inward and just sit, you're going to contact this fear. And the world is great at offering up these distractions, these things that keep us from looking at that repressed fear. And that's actually my gene key in the sphere of the core, in the sphere of vocation, the 56th, distraction. Our 5 senses keep us busy. They keep us from paying attention to what is important. But within that shadow of distraction comes the gift of enrichment, the realizing that it's the turning in from the distraction, noticing the repression is what frees us. And we're gonna have the tendency to shirk away as first lines. We're not gonna wanna look at it. But what you need to do is accept that fear with courage, accept that you can handle whatever is going to come your way. And as a first line, you're gonna tend to internalize suffering. And because of that, you're gonna struggle to express the feelings that you have. I laugh because this is such a huge part of my life. It's also interesting if we think about the 6th line in the sphere of IQ, it's the same idea here. We tend to feel shut off from the world. We tend to keep everything within ourselves. And that's the same thing that happens in the first line in the sphere of the core. So again, a reminder to look at your profile, look for these common threads and themes. I promise when you contemplate these things, you're going to see them. So to alchemize the shadow, what we need is deep self-honesty. And self-honesty is all about just sitting in the shadow. Remember, every shadow contains a gift. You're not going to transmute it if you don't sit with it. That's all you need to do, is be there. You don't need to fall victim to that fear. All you need to do is make sure that it doesn't get repressed, that you turn to look at it. One of my favorite quotes is, and this is going to be a approximation, but the difference between a man and a king is that a king doesn't turn away. The fear that you feel as a first line is the driver of humanity. It's what drives our evolution. It's what drives us to find solutions. It's what keeps us in activity. It's what furthers us along. And so it's not a bad thing. You just have to see it. And you don't have to express it like I'm doing right now, but you can if you want to. That's totally up to you. So that's our first line. Moving on now, let's look at the second line. We've got denial and ease. And I've talked throughout this series about the second line, aggression. And that comes because when we release that repression, often it comes across as anger. And that's why I talk about the second line, pointing the finger. We can't handle the fear within ourselves, and so we blame the person across from us for that fear. But unlike ones, twos don't know how to keep things in, right? Ones have a hard time with self-expression. They want to internalize. Twos are the opposite. They can't handle and they externalize what's happening. Denial looks out and it projects its suffering onto the world, usually onto other people in the world, usually onto those closest to you in your life. And the challenge for a second line is to let go of that blame, to turn it around back on yourself and to look deeply inside. Oftentimes, twos are not going to be able to control their feelings. So give yourself some grace if you're a second line. Have this conversation if you're in a relationship with somebody before you get hot, and let them know that this is a tendency of you so that they have a better chance to handle what's coming their way. Your job is to remember when you do have that overwhelming anger, that overwhelming denial come up, to remember the gift of the gene key that is in your core. That's the best way to deal with it. And remember that the pain that you're feeling isn't your pain, it's humanity's. Remember, you're born into the world with these things. This isn't an experience that happened to you. It's part of being human. And when you remember that, you remember that other people have the same experience, and other people are making and doing things because they have their own core wound, and that's what connects you to other people. You've got to catch your denial, but you can't do that through sustained effort as a second line, right? It's all about ease. Remember, this is the dancer. Twos flow with life. So the way that you catch it is through sustained contemplation, not through hard work, but from long work. And your greatest quality is ease. Anything that you do, if it's hard, you are on the wrong track as a second line. Your life's path is to flow. And what you need to remember is that your anger can be transmuted. It can be expressed in a different way than blaming somebody else. You can keep it inside, you turn it around on itself, and you use that energy as fuel to do something beautiful in the world. Create something. Help someone. There's so many different ways that it can be transmuted. And eventually what happens is that denial turns into compassion. It goes back to remembering that everyone has this core wound in whatever flavor it shows up for them. But you know that beneath this core wound, they are a slice of God like you are a slice of God. Moving on to line 3, we've got shame, and it's healed by humor. So once we emerge from denial, we see ourselves and we feel shame. You think to yourself, how could I be so blind? How can we treat people like this? How could I have missed that this was how I was seeing things? And we feel ashamed because of that. And ultimately, shame is born from this deep sense of self-loathing. We can't believe what we've done, and we feel ashamed by it. And as third lines, you don't want to look at that shame. What you like to do as a third line is run away. And we talk about the third line being the changer, the experiencer of many different things. And that on the surface can sound like a good thing, but if you change, if you leave, if you go to a new experience before you finish the cycle of the last experience, you're doomed to repeat the same cycles in your life over and over again. Shame is a part of acceptance. And in the New Age movement, certain people would tell you that you shouldn't feel ashamed of anything. And that's just not the truth. Sometimes we do things that are wrong. And you should feel shame for those things because that's what's going to allow you to grow. What you need to do is accept that shame, to turn towards it, to learn the lesson so we don't repeat the cycle. And unlike 2's projection, 3's ignore things via activity. So 2's blame. 3's, when they come up to a problem, it's not the other person's fault. There's no problem. I'm just going to run in the other direction. Shame, ultimately, though, is a deep sense of unworthiness. And that unworthiness gives you this energy to need to prove yourself. So the classic workaholic is a third line thing. I'm a 6th line for my life's work. And 6 lines, if you know about their life's path, often all the way up until 29 years old, live a third line life. And that was my life. I needed to prove to the world that I was worthy, that I could provide value, that I deserved to be here, essentially. And at least 2's yell at you, right? You know where they are. You know where you are with regard to them. 3's don't give you that opportunity because they just run away before you have a chance to even figure out what's going on. And so 3's can be really hard to know at a deep level, to get below the surface with them. So you have to slow down as a third line. That is the biggest piece of advice I have. You have to slow down so that you can feel that wound of shame. And humor is the thing that allows you to feel the shame. It helps you to process it. It's just going to be too heavy and too intense otherwise. And you have a ton of life experience and you're so able to detail oriented and to be able to see things and pick up on things. So you're going to have lots of stuff in your back pocket that can help you see the humor in situations. What you need to make sure is that you're not using humor in a way that is shallow to cover up your feelings, right? The classic like comedian situation where they're constantly cracking a joke because they feel uncomfortable and they're not willing to sit in something with someone. This isn't that. This is humor from self-love and vulnerability. This is humor poking fun at yourself, seeing the folly of your situation, seeing that all of us are a part of this beautiful, messy thing and that it's part of life for this stuff to come up and that these experiences are part of this big drama or this big comedy, this big play. And we do have an opportunity to see things through a set of eyes that allow us to transmute energy instead of get knocked down by it over and over again. So your job as a third line is to laugh at yourself, but with a sense of compassion, with a sense of vulnerability, with a sense of connection to another person. Moving on now to the fourth line, we've got rejection, which is healed by gentleness. And rejection leads to abandonment. That's what fourth lines tell themselves. And oftentimes that's how it manifests in the world. And sometimes we need to remember that these wounds manifest in a relationship with somebody else. They come from another. That's every single one of these lines, not just the fourth line. Although the fourth line, fourth lines will tend to feel it more that way. But you can come in contact with any of these wounds from another person doing something or saying something to you. So this wound is all about putting up armor, right? My parents were divorced when I was young. My dad left when I was 5 years old. And from that moment on, I knew that I was out for myself and I needed to protect myself. And that is a very fourth line way of seeing the world. We fear rejection, and so we harden ourselves. We harden our hearts. We learn how to toughen up, quote unquote. And that's not specific to fours either. That's also all of these lines. The fourth line tendency is to reject another person before they have a chance to reject you. And it can be through something that you say. It can also be, though, much subtler than that. It can be through the way that you say something, your tone, or it can be through your body language. We have, through our auras, this really detailed ability to pick up on what's happening around us. And sometimes we don't even know why we feel that way. And so fours can use that to shut somebody down before they have a chance to even get close to them in the first place. Oftentimes, fours use meanness as a way of pushing somebody else away. Ultimately, though, that meanness comes from a lack of self-love. They don't love themselves. They're worried about what the other person is going to do to them, so they are mean to them. And oftentimes that is a subconscious thing. They're not doing it on purpose. We fear being hurt by another. But you have to allow the being hurt. And I know that's crazy to say, but that's how we grow. You need to remember also, so I have the sixth gene key in the sphere of my EQ, which is conflict, diplomacy, peace. And what the sixth line tells us is that there is no other person to hurt us in the first place. We are all one and the same thing. We are a collective when it really comes down to it. So often fear is felt as tension, especially for fourth lines in the chest, around their heart. And so you have to go back as a fourth line and try to remember what it felt like before you had that constriction in your chest. And for many of you, you probably don't even remember life before that constriction occurred, and that's okay. Your body remembers, even if your brain doesn't. And so take some time to meditate, to contemplate on what it would feel like to have that openness in your heart, that openness in your chest. And when your heart softens, that's what allows joy to come. When you feel that expansion in your chest, that's when we can get into gentleness. That is how we soften, being gentle with yourself and being gentle with other people, especially when you're hurt, especially when someone else hurts you. Be gentle to yourself. Give yourself love. Give the other person love. When you give yourself love, which is where you need to focus first and foremost as a fourth line, that's what allows you to be gentle with another person. You're no longer a victim of rejection when you've learned how to be gentle with yourself, because there's this opportunity for you to recognize again that they also are just somebody who came into this world with a wound. Moving on now to the fifth line, we've got guilt and forgiveness is how we heal that guilt. And the fifth line, shadow, is probably the most complicated shadow that there is, which is kind of hilarious because fives love practicality. They love simplicity. And guilt is different from shame. Guilt is this looking back at humanity and thinking, how could we do this? We look at World War II, we look at World War I, we look at what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine, and we have this guilt of what are we doing? Threes run away, right? And they turn to activity, whereas five's solution at the shadow frequency to that problem is to chase power. Because if they can get power, they can think about changing the world. Fives feel this huge pressure to be a certain way. And whether they change themselves to fill that gap for somebody else, or they can go into reaction and be the opposite of what somebody else projects onto them. Either way, they're not being who they actually are. Fives feed off of power struggles. They need to gain an advantage. And the way that they do that is to use guilt. They use manipulation. But using that guilt constantly forces them over and over into situations that make their life more complicated, more complex, and fills them with more guilt and more regret. And so we get stuck in this cycle. And again, fives hate complexity. They just want things to be simple. Oftentimes, fives will just give up on life altogether and on people altogether. Even after they do that, though, the sense of guilt still haunts them. It's not going to go away. So that's not the way to solve the problem. You cannot escape this at a mental level. It's too complex of an issue. What you've got to do is feel the vulnerability of the fear. Feel the vulnerability of this guilt and realize that it doesn't make you weak unless you feel victimized by it, which is a choice that you make. You can use it to make you stronger. You can use it to drive forgiveness in your life. But it's not even your fear that you're feeling here, right? It's not even your issue that's causing this guilt. It goes back to the collective. So your role is to transmute that guilt for the collective. Your role is to start to forgive humanity internally. And when enough people do that, externally, things will begin to change. Your life will offer an opportunity to forgive the unforgivable over and over again as a fifth line. And what came up for me as I thought about that is the 60th gene key, which I have in the sphere of my purpose. And the city of that gene key is justice. And justice is not how we think about it. It's not an eye for an eye. Justice is forgiveness. Justice is allowing the world, allowing God to redress the balance of things. That's why we have the scales when we think of justice. It's all about this sense of universal balance. You have to see that your behavior is driven by your core wound. You have to see that other people's behavior is driven by their core wound. And when you can see that in somebody, then you can start to forgive them because they are not their personality. They are not the things that they do. They were conditioned to be that way. And that doesn't mean that you have to validate that behavior, but it does create the space for you to be able to forgive them. And then as you forgive them, you'll be able to forgive yourself. Finally, now we move on to the sixth line, which the wound here, I actually wrote indifference, but it's actually separation. Apologies. So separation, and then the way that we heal that is with care. And this is the epitome of human awareness right now. We experience ourselves as separate from other people. But that isn't the truth. We are one person. We are not our physiology. We're not our bodies. We're not our psychology, what's happening in our brains. We're not our emotional body. We are one thing. All of those things that I just said are simply an illusion that keeps us from the truth, that keeps us in separation. And the 6th line wound is the most recent of all the wounds. It is like the 1st line wound is the oldest. The 6th line wound is the newest. And because of that, we have this feeling that we are different as 6 lines from everyone and everything else that is happening in the world. And so you feel aloof and you feel cut off because of that. And the 6th line has to bring that sense of separateness into their awareness. 6s, when they're born, tend to be like really hypersensitive. And because of that, everyone can see them as different and they learn to alter their behavior. And then you pair that with the homogenization of school and needing to get a job and needing to be a cog in this machine that we call society, and we lose that. And it's your job as a 6th line to reawaken that sensitivity in yourself, to go back to finding what those gifts were that you had when you were a child. And this takes a long time. Remember, 6 lines live this 3-part life. And so you're not going to fully understand this until you're in your 50s. Be gentle with yourself. Give yourself time. Oftentimes, you're going to feel as a 6th line this profound drive to be a spiritual seeker. And that's what's going to lead you to rediscover those gifts. Aloneness is also a really common theme for 6 lines. Again, this separation, this aloofness, this aloneness. And so that can make relationships really hard for 6 lines because they think that they're not like the person that's sitting across from them. And you might have a tendency to feel locked out of the world and like everyone else is in on something that you don't understand. It's like you don't get the joke. But no one's keeping anything from you. You alone as a 6th line have the opportunity to plug yourself back into the world. It's nobody else's fault. You've got to learn to include yourself again. And the way that you do that is through care, through self-care. Your heart has to be rekindled. You've got to re-engage. You've got to start to care about things again. Indifference and separation are a scary wound. This is how something like the Holocaust can happen. This is how we let people die of hunger even though we have an abundance of food on this planet. And so once you start to care again, you're going to feel alive again. And you'll see that you have so much to offer the world as a 6th line. You are our vision holders. You are taking us in a new direction. So this is a deep one. And it's very important that you start to understand this, because understanding this piece allows us to be connected to one another. And then it breaks through into, how can I be in service so that other people can have that same breakthrough? All right, so we've got one more sphere left with our 6 lines. After that, I'm actually going to move on to all of the pathways. So we're going to go pathway of pathway. So it's like pathway of challenge, pathway of breakthrough, pathway of core stability in the activation sequence. And then we'll do each of the pathways from the Venus sequence. And then the Pearl. I'm not sure if I'll go in order or what I'm going to do there, but that's what's coming next. Also, reminder, we've got a call on Friday. It's free. It's on Google Meet. If you click the community tab, I have the link posted there right now. If you have any questions, as always, please leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer. Thank you guys for being here. Until next time.